Perfect. Okay, we'll just wait to see what happens. So hi, welcome anybody who's joining us. We're just going to wait a few moments to get started here while people sign on to the webinar. And then for those of you who don't know, my name is Amara. I'm with the Trumbull Library. Okay, we'll probably just give it a few more moments here. Thanks for your patience, everybody. And again, we're just going to wait until a little after 12:05 here. All right, well, we'll probably just go ahead and get started here. So my name is Amara. I'm an adult services librarian for Trumbull Library System. So welcome to our afternoon author talk, The Planter of Modern Life with Stephen Heyman. The Planter of Modern Life is the astounding tale of a rare and accomplished figure who has vanished from popular memory despite his importance. So Louis Bromfield was a World War I ambulance driver, a Paris expat, and a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist as famous in the 1920s as Hemingway or Fitzgerald. But he cashed in his literary success to finance a wild agrarian dream in his native Ohio. The ideas he planted at this utopian experimental farm, Malabar, would inspire America's first generation of organic farmers and popularize the tenets of environmentalism years before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The sweeping biography unearths a lost icon of American culture, a fascinating, hilarious, and unclassifiable character who, between writing and plowing, also dabbled in global politics and high society. Through it all, Louis Bromfield fought for an agriculture that would enrich the soil and protect the planet. While Bromfield's name has faded into obscurity, his mission seems more critical today than ever. So the author, Stephen Heyman, is a writer, an editor based in Innsbruck, Austria. His first book, The Planter of Modern Life, won the IACP Award for Literary Historical Food Writing and was longlisted for the Pulitzer Prize for Best Biography. A former features editor at T, the New York Times Style magazine, he has written for The Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Slate, Vogue, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. In 2018, he was named a fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Amara. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be with you today from Innsbruck, where it's a bit later in the evening. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. Hold on one second. Okay, can you see just the book cover? Yes. Are we good?
We can see the presenter view again.
Ah, yes. Okay. How about now?
Perfect, just the book cover.
Excellent. Okay. So let's see, where to begin? Let us begin in 2015 with the first time I heard the name Louis Bromfield. I was not living in Innsbruck at the time. I was living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had just moved there. And I happened to meet a farmer who was an elder statesman in the world of sustainable agriculture. And I was asking him why he got into farming back in the 1960s. And he mentioned reading the books of a guy, reading the books by a guy named Louis Bromfield, who had a famous farm in Ohio named Malabar. And I had never heard Bromfield's name before. And I thought I knew most of the heroes of environmentalism and sustainable agriculture, people like Rachel Carson and Irving Rodale. But Bromfield's name just, was a blank for me. Anyways, I got home, I just Googled him, and I fell down this marvelous rabbit hole where I discovered somebody who began his career as a novelist of great renown. He lived in France between the wars. He won the Pulitzer Prize. He hung out with famous people from all walks of life. But then he completely changed course and had a amazing kind of ability to anticipate problems that are still very much with us today. So I'm just going to take you through some of the high points of the book, and then I think we'll do questions afterwards. So I want to begin in Paris, one of my favorite places in the 1920s, by kind of contrasting where Bromfield was in 1925 compared to two of his best-known contemporaries. In 1925, when Bromfield moved to Paris, F. Scott Fitzgerald was kind of mourning the commercial failure of The Great Gatsby. And Hemingway, this kind of ex-newspaperman, was working furiously on The Sun Also Rises. And both of them were kind of envious of the new guy in town, Bromfield, who had published two books that shot to the top of the bestseller list and was about to come out with his third novel, Early Autumn, which would win the Pulitzer Prize in 1926. That year, the New York Times pronounced Bromfield the best and most vital of all the young American novelists writing in that period. Bromfield didn't take the typical expatriate course through 20s Paris. He didn't rent a kind of garret on the left bank. Instead, he rented this luxurious apartment with the proceeds from his novels overlooking the Bois de Boulogne. And he was a guy who cared a lot for material comfort. He spent a lot of time furnishing the apartment. He took up painting. He went on vacation to the Basque Country. He really soaked up the delights of Paris, and he had a lot of contempt for kind of the navel-gazing dwellers of Montparnasse, who he thought, spent their days drinking to excess and not producing any work of note, with a few exceptions. But he's a country boy at heart, and shortly after moving to Paris, decides he's sick of the city life, and instead he wants to return to the country. So I'm just going to skip over this next slide, moves to a town called Senlis, which is about 30 minutes north of Paris, and it's on a little river called the Nonette. And there he begins to renovate an old priory, which he turns into this kind of open air salon, and it attracts all types of people, a lot of people from the American colony, but international people as well. Bromfield has 3 girls, and they live there very well. hunting mushrooms in the forest and eating delicious dinners that Bromfield makes. And a lot of the food that they ate came from his incredible garden, which was really in terrible shape when he took over the place. But through what he learned working on his grandfather's farm in Ohio, and also from what he learned from his peasant neighbors in Senlis, he managed to kind of revive the land. And he turned this riverside garden into really a splendid, very intoxicating place. His etching by an artist named Frances Rose, a protege of Gertrude Stein, who was a very good friend of Bromfield's. And he grew all types of flowers, musk roses, phlox, calendula, marigolds, candytuft, godetia, foxglove, delphinium. The list goes on and on. He actually noted each flower that he planted each season in his journals, which I looked through at the Ohio State University. So it was a very appealing place that he created, a work of art in itself, in addition to his novels. And as I mentioned, it attracted lots of people. And Bromfield's wife, was kind of the society photographer in the place, and she created these albums. And the albums have kind of documented some of the people who were drawn into this kind of garden world that Bromfield created. And I'll just point out a few of them. So in the top left photo, you have Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. And then to the right is the fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli, Janet Flanner, and a lot of other female writers are pictured on the little bridge going over the Nonette near Bromfield's house. And then in the bottom right is Ina Claire, stage and screen star. So all these people were kind of jumbled together in Bromfield's garden. He had a particularly close friendship with Gertrude Stein, who greatly admired his literature and his acumen as a gardener. She had a place in the country with Alice Toklas, and she often would write Bromfield asking for advice on what to plant and how to manage their little vegetable patch. Another significant friendship that Bromfield had was with the great American novelist Edith Wharton, who was another expatriate, although in a very different kind of social milieu than Gertrude Stein. And she lived not far from Senlis in a town called Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt. And she had these magnificent formal gardens. And Bromfield and they had this beautiful relationship, which really had very little to do with literature ultimately. As Bromfield wrote in an unpublished memoir about Wharton, he said, "We seldom discussed our writing, but we talked frequently and at great length of our dahlias and our petunias, our green peas and lettuces." I think Wharton, as with the peasant gardeners that were his neighbors in Senlis, also kind of informed his idea of what was possible with the land and in this period. Bromfield had this concept called tetched, which came from a distant cousin of his named Phoebe Wise, who was kind of this. She sounds like a folkloric character, like something made up. But I actually found newspaper articles from the turn of the century that talked about her as a real person who lived outside of Mansfield, Ohio, in a kind of cottage that was overgrown with all this crazy vegetation. She was a famous spinster in the time who lived with animals, and Bromfield loved visiting her with his father. And when she saw the young Bromfield playing in her gardens with the animals and among the plants, she said to his father, Charlie, that boy is touched. And what she meant was that he was a little crazy. But what she really meant was that he had this kind of kinship with nature that, that couldn't be taught, that was very instinctive. And, a mystical connection, as Bromfield called it. There's this great quote from Edith Wharton's memoirs, which I think captures this, although she doesn't use the word touched, but she's talking about a childhood experience of her own where she's walking through the woods in Westchester County, New York. It's not too far from you folks. And she talks about feeling something in me quite incommunicable to others that was tremblingly and inarticulately awake to every detail of wind-warped fern and wide-eyed briar rose. She wasn't merely sensitive to the superficial beauty of these plants, but to a, quote, unifying magic beneath the diversities, the visible scene, a power with which I was in deep and solitary communion whenever I was alone with nature. So this is touched, and this idea I think is very central to Bromfield's love of the land, and something that's going to come more to the fore as his life continues. As I mentioned, Bromfield learned a tremendous amount from his peasant neighbors, and specifically from one gardener named PK, who taught him how, basically how to compost, how to grow vegetables and raise beds, how to get the most out of the growing season, and this knowledge will be important not just in terms of feeding Bromfield's children, but in terms of the knowledge that he'll bring back to America to solve some major agricultural problems. And he's already seeing the evidence of those problems in the 30s in Senlis. He has to watch from afar as the Dust Bowl happens, as people are suffering from incidents of widespread soil erosion in the South caused by ruinous farming practices. And all of this, of course, is occurring in the midst of a terrible economic depression, which is causing people to kind of reassess, the fundamental economics of life. And Bromfield is also in the midst of this big soul searching, and he decides to write what I think is one of his best novels. It's called The Farm. It's written in 1930. It comes out in 1933, and it's basically a kind of glorified family memoir. Gertrude Stein thought it was remarkable, the best thing he had ever done up to that point. And it really marks a shift where Bromfield is not merely a kind of hobbyist gardener whose real passion and vocation is literature, but actually a literary artist and thinker whose primary subject is agriculture, or our relationship with the land. So it's a very important book. And from this point, Bromfield begins talking about, basically becoming a farmer. And Edith Wharton, despite her love of gardening, is alarmed by this prospect. And she writes to him in 1933, "I wish that writing a book called The Farm wouldn't immediately make you decide to buy one. If action always follows so rapidly on thought, you will have an agitated existence, and so will Mary." Mary is Bromfield's long-suffering wife. There's one more episode that we need to discuss during Bromfield's years abroad, and this is his travels to India. He takes 2 long trips to India in the 1930s, and these trips inform his best-selling, most commercially successful novel, The Rains Came, which is turned into a major Hollywood blockbuster, the first film ever to win the Oscar for special effects. But I think perhaps more importantly, Bromfield links up in India with a guy named Albert Howard, who's kind of the founding father of the organic movement. And he learns about a whole new approach to agriculture, which he's going to kind of integrate with the knowledge he picks up from his peasant neighbors in Senlis when he finally comes back to America in 1938. After the Munich conference, Bromfield basically saw which way the wind was blowing in Europe. He understood that war was coming, and he wanted to get his family out, and he wanted to return to America and not go back to New York or Los Angeles, places that he had visited or lived in before, where a celebrity novelist would be quite comfortable. But he wanted to return to an honest-to-God farm and build a kind of, fortress manor, as he called it, a place where he, his family, his friends could live off the land, essentially. He had these kind of Jeffersonian fantasies of what his American life could be. And he also wanted to return to his native country because he was born in Mansfield, Ohio, and that's where he went back to. So he was driving around kind of the area where he used to hang out as a child and play, and he found an old farmhouse. And he fell in love with it, and he decided to make it the kind of core of a very extravagant 19-room Greek revival style mansion, which would be the epicenter of a very large farm. And he gave the farm an Indian name, Malabar, because India had, in a roundabout way, financed it by inspiring him to write that very lucrative novel, The Rains Came. But you have to remember that it was winter when Bromfield saw the farmhouse that he fell in love with. And as a result, the fields were covered with snow. So when the fields thawed in the spring of 1939, he discovered that his dream farm was essentially worthless from an agricultural point of view. The fields had suffered from erosion. There were huge gullies, so big you could lose a horse inside of them. And, this was a several 100-acre property. And Bromfield was totally overwhelmed, despite whatever knowledge he had of farming and gardening from France or from his boyhood in Ohio. So he decided to get help. And he found a young guy named Max Drake, who was linked up with several New Deal era soil and conservation groups, the Soil Conservation Service and the CCC. And Drake gave him the expertise and the knowledge to revive Malabar and to turn this eroded hill farm into a real paradise. And Bromfield found this work of reviving the land more meaningful than any of the novels that he had written up to this point. And he begins a whole host of experiments at Malabar, where he's promoting, the cutting edge in soil science and agriculture, using cover crops, contour plowing, composting at scale, and, experimenting with no-till farming and grass farming. These things are now the foundation of organic and sustainable agriculture. They were pioneered really at Malabar. And so Bromfield not only used his farm as a kind of test site for these new techniques, he also used it as a place to propagate ideas into excite and even convert people to the cause. He had this hill called Mount Gees at the farm, which overlooked all the pastures. It was really beautiful. And he would lead these groups up to the field and give these impromptu lectures each Sunday. And, in addition to this kind of personal advocacy, he also was part of an extraordinary organization called Friends of the Land, which brought together people from all walks of life, and they published a very influential journal. And they really mainstreamed a lot of the tenets of environmentalism, years before Silent Spring. It was quite a discovery for me to find out about the land and the Friends of the Land, and kind of this forgotten episode of American environmental history. Another thing that Bromfield was ahead of the times on was DDT and the harm caused by chemical pesticides, basically. He understood, I think, the greater problem with chemicals, which is not merely that they could be toxic or harmful in themselves, but that they upset the delicate balance of nature and begin a kind of arms race where you have to create ever more powerful pesticides to overcome the natural resistance pests develop to whatever chemical you're spraying on your fields. Bromfield testified in Congress about the dangers of DDT. And unfortunately, his testimony and that of a lot of other far-sighted people were not, at least not immediately, listened to. And his advocacy, went beyond agriculture. In the 1940s, he advocated very strongly for America to do more about the Holocaust as it was unfolding. This was a guy who was very engaged in many different facets of public life. And here you see a telegram that he sent to his friend Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House, basically begging her to do more to stop the butchery, the slaughter of innocent civilians, as he put it. And he joined an organization that published large ads in newspapers that were designed to kind of shock the conscience of Americans about what was happening in Europe. But he was bombastic and arrogant and sometimes wrong. And an example of that is the panic that he began during World War II, when he said that basically Americans were running out of food and that a famine was coming. And critics called him the prophet of starvation. I think his concerns were justified. He was worried that too many farm workers were being drafted and too much equipment that was necessary to feed the home front and to, create all the food supplies necessary for soldiers fighting the war. All that equipment was going to military uses. So though he took a lot of flack, he thought this campaign was necessary to gain the exemptions required to protect the American food system. Another notable error that he made was the advocacy of Multiflora Rose, which I don't know if the gardeners in your group know about this, but this is an invasive species which in the 1950s and 60s was thought to be an ideal, quote, living fence, something that could be used to shore up soil erosion and to create a kind of natural fence between pastures that livestock couldn't penetrate. Unfortunately, it has spread wildly. Many of the people in Richland County, Ohio, who I met while researching the story still have not forgiven Bromfield for his advocacy of Multiflora Rose. And I always have to point out to him that he was merely promoting, as he often did, the best soil science had to offer at the time, and that this was also advocated by the Soil Conservation Service. But I think they still blame Bromfield, which I think is a measure of how successful he was in promoting these ideas. So Malabar was not only a kind of test station for agricultural ideas, it was also a celebrity hotspot in the Midwest, believe it or not. And its crowning moment in this regard was the 1945 wedding of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Bromfield was very good friends with Bogart, and he certainly found Bacall very charming. He wanted to host their wedding because he was their friend, but I think he shrewdly used the publicity of that event to further his his project at Malabar. So he was a kind of expert at PR before that term was really even known. And all through his life, Bromfield attracted remarkable women. I mentioned Edith Wharton and Gertrude Stein, two very different women who had very deep connections with Bromfield. Another woman who he became close to and even had a love affair with was Doris Duke. So they fell in love after Bromfield's wife Mary died in the 1950s, and she initially got in touch with him because she basically needed help with Duke Farms, her sprawling estate in New Jersey. Bromfield helped her with the farm, and in the process, they kind of, a romance began, and she got extremely close to him. And it kind of took a tragic turn because Bromfield himself got very sick with cancer, but Duke continued to care for him and even gave some injections that was necessary to his treatment. So theirs was a very special bond. And after Bromfield died, she essentially bailed out the farm, and that's why there's a section of woods in Malabar State Park, because Bromfield's farm is now a beautiful state park, which, if any of you are in Ohio, I would encourage you to visit. But anyways, that is why a section of woods in Malabar State Park is named today the Doris Duke Woods. And the last important thing you need to know about Bromfield is that he was not only a very far-sighted pioneer of sustainable agriculture, but he was also a great animal lover. He had an amazing connection with all types of animals. Here you have with a raccoon and his famous boxer dogs, half a dozen of which lived at Malabar at any given time. He wrote 3 very good memoirs about the farm beginning in 1945's Pleasant Valley, which I'd encourage you to read. It's a great kind of entry point if you're interested in reading Bromfield's work. But I think that the writer who perhaps summed up Malabar better than anyone else, better than Bromfield himself, was E.B. White, who wrote a poem about Malabar in the New Yorker magazine. And I just want to read to you one stanza from this poem, because I think you'll get a sense of the atmosphere of the place and what made it so special. So E.B. White writes, "A farm is always in some kind of tizzy, but Bromfield's place is really busy. Strangers arriving by every train, Bromfield terracing against the rain, catamounts crying, mowers mowing, guest rooms full to overflowing, boxers in every room of the house, cows being milked to Brahms and Strauss, kids arriving by van and pung, Bromfield up to his eyes in dung, sailors, trumpeters, mystics, actors, all of them wanting to drive the tractors, all of them eager to husk the corn, some of them sipping their drinks till morn. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Louis
My
Bromfield
pleasure.
is quite a character. And yeah, if anybody would like to raise their hand to speak a question, or if you'd like to include it in chat or Q&A, look at all of those areas. But I do have a question.
Yes.
What about Louis Bromfield's life and doing your research struck you the most odd or sort of altruistic fact about this man and his journey?
So many things. I mean, I mentioned the kind of special connection that he had with women, which I think was atypical for his generation. Especially you think about some of his contemporaries like Hemingway and Fitzgerald. It's hard to imagine them, developing these kinds of tender relationships where they talk about musk roses, as he did with Edith Wharton. But I found him so irrepressible, and his energy was incredible. The flip side of that was, of course, carelessness. As a writer, I tend to be very careful, verging on tortured, and I think Bromfield was the opposite. He was constantly writing and planting and mowing and living, and so that zest for life really came through very strongly, and it was something that I tried to convey in the book as best I could.
Do you think in some ways the way we talk about climate change and all the things that have happened today, a lot of the conversations are dark or not necessarily, they're more pessimistic in nature? Do you think if having a character like Louis Bromfield around to be the opposite side of that would sort of encourage more people to make changes in their life? Do you think sometimes when we present the negative too much and not the experience that could be had if we made certain changes in our own life makes it more accessible or less accessible?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. I often think about what Bromfield would be like if he were somehow, transported to our time and place. I think that the climate change stuff makes it difficult to talk about things without verging on the apocalyptic. Nevertheless, I do think that he was a happy warrior. Whatever he was doing, and I do think that he managed to convey the gravity of the problem, even if it's sometimes exaggerating the severity of it, while also making it seem like the solution was the way to a richer, more meaningful, a more deeply rooted life. I think that there was nothing joyless about the solution, about his prescriptions, and certainly nothing joyless about his life. I mean, he understood more than most people the drudgery involved in growing your own food and in taking care of the land, and doing it kind of the hard way. But he also could capture the beauty of that existence and the value of it. So yeah, I wish that we had more people like him today. I don't know whether it would what it would amount to exactly, but I do think that those types of voices are lacking.
We do have a question from Peter. There's a town in Florida called Malabar. Do you know if there's any connection to your knowledge with Bromfield's Malabar?
I don't. I mean, Malabar is a real place in India. Well, actually, it could refer to the Malabar Hill in outside of when Bromfield visited, it was called Bombay. And when he visited, he saw these amazing burial sites where basically the Zoroastrian community in Bombay left their dead to be, they exposed their dead to scavenger birds. And this kind of really informed a lot of his, and this whole reverence for the cycle of life, a totally different worldview than he had grown up with. And I think that was important and part of the reason why he called the farm Malabar. But there's also the Malabar coast of India, which Bromfield visited. And I think that he, his experience in India broadly explains why he chose to name the farm Malabar. I don't know what the connection is with the Florida place exactly, but I don't think it has anything to do with Bromfield.
Okay, then we have another question. Can you say something about what archives you consulted, where they are, and some of what you found there?
Love it. Yes. Well, so most of Bromfield's papers are located at the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library at Ohio State University. So the bulk of stuff is there. There's also some materials at the farm in Ohio, which, as I mentioned, is now a state park. And then I searched far and wide, as you do when you write a biography. I had to go to Connecticut. I had to go to the Beinecke Library to get Bromfield's letters in Edith Wharton and Gertrude Stein's collections, and a whole host of other university libraries and small archives in Ohio, and the list goes on and on. But the bulk of the stuff is at Ohio State in Columbus.
Okay, well, we don't seem to have any more questions, but how many years of research did it take you to write this?
Well, so I heard Bromfield's name for the first time in 2015. The book came out in 2020. I would say the research and the writing took about 3 years, 3 to 4 years, during which, and maybe like 2 years of extremely concentrated work. Yeah.
Okay. And then a final question, not related to the book, but just to being an author that I like to ask. At what point in your early life did you have an experience where you understood that words had power and could make changes?
Wow. I've never thought about that. At what point did I understand that words have power? It probably would have been when I was it would have gone back to the beginning, I suppose. Some of my earliest composition assignments, when I realized that I might, have things that I could structure my mundane existence in a way that could interest somebody else, But I don't know exactly how to answer that question. I'm a little stumped by it. I mean, it's such a basic thing, but the first time I realized that words had power. I mean, I've been doing this since I was in high school, really, and it's been, I think that when you're young, when you start young, like Bromfield did, because he was a reporter on his high school newspaper, you begin to see the world in a different way, and I think that you're always looking at things from the perspective of an outsider. And so storytelling or portraying something to somebody else secondhand is is kind of like your automatic mode, if that makes sense. And you don't think of it as anything special. It's just kind of part of you.
Hmm. So you have a connection maybe in a way to writing into words that other people don't, or take time to get there.
I have no idea. I think that I've been, writing stories for a long time and thinking about what makes, a good story or a story worth telling. I think for me, not being an expert, like, in the case of this book, I was neither an expert in 20th century American literature nor in the history of agriculture, right? So the bar for me was pretty high, but I thought, here's a story that I find very moving and hasn't been told, and I think it connects with something, um, something about our current moment, and I think it's relevant in a way. And so I felt like, it was an opportunity for me. If I could see it, and perhaps other people wouldn't see this story, but I would never say that I, have a way of looking at the world as a writer that other people don't, because I have no idea what it's like to be other people. I mean, I think that to some extent that is the great gift of writing, is that you can approach that level of the empathy necessary to understand someone else. And that's why biography is so powerful. Because for the biographer, you get to spend all this time getting inside someone else's head. But if you do a good job, the reader will, invariably put themselves in the position of the subject and wonder, how they are similar and how they are different and what they would have done in that situation. And I think that there's a certain kind of self-expansion that occurs when you read a great biography. So, I kept that in mind when I was writing, and I tried to do it. I don't know if I succeeded, but that was the goal, at least.
Well, I think that's a wonderful answer to the question. And
Sorry,
we have one.
You really
No,
stumped me
it
there.
came full circle there, I think, in the end, ultimately. And I would say you definitely achieved that goal of the reader being able to, see themselves in that place, and would they have done this? Would they have done that? How are they, acting today? But we did have one final question come in here.
Yes.
And it was, you must have read Bromfield's novels. What did you think of them as works of fiction?
Yeah, you actually asked me that question before we got on, and it's one I get a lot. And I would say that Bromfield's novels are a mixed bag, like his life. I mentioned that kind of carelessness and his great productivity. This is the guy who wrote 30 odd books, and some of them are great. The Rains Came, I think, is a really entertaining, extremely rich novel about India, which holds up. The Early Autumn, the book that he won the Pulitzer for, if you like, Edith Wharton or Galsworthy, or you'll probably like that book too. But I think that in my book, I made the case that Bromfield should be remembered chiefly as a kind of prophet of environmentalism or sustainable agriculture, and to access that side of him, you'll want to look at his farm books. And the place to start there is with Pleasant Valley, which came out in 1945, and which kind of captures a lot of the adventure of Malabar. And if you know a little about the environmental and agricultural problems that we're facing today, you will be shocked to see how little has changed, or how kind of quickly we understood a lot of the problems of industrial agriculture and how we've repeatedly failed to solve them. So that bit is a bit depressing, but very interesting.
Well, I think with that, we've come to the end of our author talk this afternoon. It's been a lovely journey through Louis Bromfield's life in your mind. I appreciate all the answers to your questions, or to the questions from the audience and myself today. And thank everybody that has joined us for the afternoon. It was lovely of you to make time for us. And we hope to see you at some other dinner disrupted programs or Trumbull Library programs in the future. And again, thank you, Stephen, for your time.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.